And I am going to turn it over to Dr. Karan Lamb to talk about OCD doubt.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to talk about this module. I kind of love it, and I kind of get a bit frustrated with this module because it's easy to slip into some traps here. So I think we're going to learn together about this one. I will say I am not an expert on this, so I hope that we're going to learn together about how OCD doubt is 100% irrelevant. I'm just going to review what Amanda talked about last week, which is normal doubt versus obsessional doubt, and we're going to build on it. Normal doubt, we are really using direct evidence from what we see, what we hear, our common sense. It occurs within the context of what we're experiencing, and it's easily and quickly resolved without compulsions. The obsessional doubt that we're going to be building on today is really built in our imagination. It's the story that comes from within. And I just put a note on this slide just to remind ourselves to notice how our clients are hearing this, how this story comes from within, because it can be really empowering, but it also can be confusing, especially in this module and how we're applying it. This obsessional doubt, it occurs without the direct evidence with the here and now. And I'm going to kind of turn to this because normal doubt, I've been away for 2.5 weeks in Spain and went paragliding. And I literally told myself I'm going to run off a cliff. And I had some normal doubt. That was a great idea. But as you can see, it worked out really well. However, when I got back, I was like, I have a week to prepare for this presentation, and my whole family and I have been sick this week. So I prepared last night, and the obsessional doubt of I'm not going to get it complete, it's not going to make sense, it's going to be incoherent. There's a recording that you all are going to know that I don't know what I'm talking about. You can see how obsessional doubt really can get there even before I made my PowerPoint. Just so you know, I'm asking for a great deal of grace today because I'm not quite sure my PowerPoint makes great sense, but it does for the amount of time I had. These are the things where I'm hoping we're going to really get some good conversation about. The irrelevancy of OCD doubts. I don't know if others think this way, but to say it's 100% irrelevant to reality is a very interesting concept to me, because how often do we say 100% in things? The doubt is impossible precisely because it goes against the senses. I'm hoping we're going to give a lot of examples today from just using made up case examples, nothing specific since we're being recorded, but understanding how is it possible that our doubts can really go against the senses, especially obsessional doubt. And here's the thing. In the manual, it says, with the realization that the obsessional doubt is 100% irrelevant, the OCD and its cognitive behavioral sequences are resolved. Like, that's a pretty remarkable statement, isn't it? And for those who've been doing I-CBT, you've seen how these sequences really can get resolved much earlier in the sequence by understanding obsessional doubt versus normal doubt and some of the things that we're going to talk about today. I will say I have a Kindle version, and I don't know if my page numbers match up with people who have a hard copy of the book. So if my page numbers look different that I reference to, it just could be because I have a Kindle. The goal of Module 6, this is what we're working with our clients, is to help them understand the process that obsessional doubt is not attached to the sensory data in the here and now, so that the doubt will lose credibility. Now, what does that look like? I'm definitely going to go through some examples of that. But I think that's a really important goal to keep in mind, that the doubt loses credibility when we're really thinking about how it is not attached to their common senses in the here and now. If you remember the anatomy of the obsessional doubt, it's generated subjectively. It is removed from the data. In the chapter, they talk about meteors, ceiling falling. And if anyone wants me to review those examples, I can. If you're familiar with those examples, I won't.
Karen, can you go ahead and review one?
Okay. I was just looking at the chat. So in the handbook, when it talks about meteors falling from the sky, the example is, if I say, hey, meteors are going to fall and hit you in the head, most people would say, I don't think that's possible or probable, so I'm not really going to worry about it, and they don't even give it another thought. However, if there are fireballs falling from the sky, if I see something, then that information about, I think meteors are going to hit me in the head, become much more real, and that's a normal doubt if I see a fireball. But most often, if I just think it, it's in the imagination. So it's missing the context. It's missing that sensory information. Working with an adult who might say, you know, I'm really aware of how buildings are constructed. And this happens to be related to an event that happened here in Florida. So I'm really checking when I go into a building, is this a sound building? Do I hear creaks? Do I hear noises? Is it telling me that it's going to fall down? That individual is relying more on the imagination in that situation. They are checking for creaks versus what's going on right in front of them. And so we really want to be thoughtful with our clients and understand, you know what's the basis of the process that you've got to start to believe in this obsessional doubt. The obsessional doubt cannot be resolved like normal doubts. Eventually, when you run off a cliff, you're going to realize whether the hang gliding or the paragliding works. And you're going to usually realize it pretty quickly. It gets resolved. However, if you go into buildings over and over and you're checking and you're looking to see, are there any cracks? Are there any foundational problems? What you're going to notice is it doesn't get resolved. What you're actually doing is getting deeper and deeper into the doubt sequence and the doubt content. And that's where we're really looking to notice the process with our clients. To give an example of a professional female, she struggles to choose a flight, because if she chooses the flight, then she could be responsible for all those on the plane that could be harmed if that plane crashes. And when you look at that, what is it going on right in front of her when she's in front of her computer screen that tells her her selection will be the one thing that determines whether that plane is safe or not? And what she can do is she can look at other places where she is willing to make decisions. And I'm going to come back to this example a few times, because how do we normally choose a flight? Based on time, based on availability, based on some other things that are right in front of us. However, when you can really get stuck in the story of, I may be responsible for what happens to this flight because I chose it, you can really see the anatomy of the obsessional doubt is based on the justification of possibilities. What we're going to review, and honestly, selectivity of doubt is like one of my favorite concepts. I have a lot of fun with this idea, But we are going to look at the process of making obsessional doubts irrelevant. And this word irrelevant is really an important one. Possible versus probable, selectivity of doubt, and realizing irrelevancy. These are the three areas that I'm hoping we're going to really understand a bit better and a bit more nuanced by the end of our discussion today. I put in some tips that I've learned that have helped me. Does the client accept that the doubt originates from within the imagination without the senses? This is just kind of something I'm paying attention to because it helps me know if I need to go a little bit more in depth with my current module, if I need to use some non-OCD specific situations to really get the skill and the process a little bit more understood. But I like to pay attention. How much do we both agree, or how much are we understanding where the process is and what the process of doubt looks like? In the manual, it talks about possible versus probable. And this, if you search the listserv and you look up this topic, you will see in March, there was a lot of discussion about this topic. Is the fact that something's possible justifying the obsessional doubt or make it relevant? Really, because something's possible, and I think where I've come down on this is I don't want to refute possibilities with people because it's going to really send us in the wrong direction. I want to say, yeah, some things are possible, and can we notice the process? I think there's a big nuance in there to pay attention to. Some of the questions that the manual recommends asking: does this doubt warrant checking, washing, worrying? Does this doubt warrant basically the behaviors we're doing? Do we know and then we do? Are we doing because we think we know? Without evidence in the here and now, and you're going to see I've become like your cable news network person. I keep going back to this phrase: without evidence in the here and now, the doubt becomes irrelevant. But it can still be possible. And I think this is a complicated discussion of how can something be possible but irrelevant. And I don't know if anyone wants to add in and add something here. You're welcome to. If not, I'll keep talking.
It's,
Okay.
I can jump in there since you're asking, but why is that a difficult concept, you think? Or is it something that is difficult for people? Because a lot of things are possible, you know, like that sort of like goes back to the example of a meteor, you know, like, yeah, meteors may fall on my head right now, but is it relevant, right? It's not, right? So that's the basic idea. So people come up with possibilities and then sort of like think these possibilities are somehow relevant to the here and now. But there are always possibilities that are applied out of context. And this is what makes it irrelevant, right? And 100% irrelevant in the case of OCD, we would argue, right? So it's not a matter of gradation, because it's not like this concept of overestimation of threat, right? Where a person exaggerates the probability of something happening. That's not this sort of the dimension we're talking about, because then OCD would no longer be different from any other anxiety disorder. But what I-CBT claims here is that this is unique to OCD. I mean, it may to some extent apply, but what we really see in OCD is this sort of reliance on information, that's possibilities, that's then taken out of context and sort of like moved into the here and now. And then suddenly there seems to be evidence for something in the here and now that should not be, because it's taken out of context. That's this whole idea of the 100% irrelevance, which we consider to be a unique process for OCD. So for example, if you see a spider and you have this thought, the spider may jump and bite me. Would it be an obsessional doubt? Anybody? An answer, would it be obsessional? It would not be. It would be because it's in context. There's a spider in front of you, and spiders do jump and bite. So it's in context, right? So the fear is in context, probably a phobia of some kind, or an exaggerated fear, whatever it may be. But it's not OCD. Now, if I look for spiders without seeing anyone, and I look in my bed for hours without seeing anything, then you're dealing likely with an obsessional doubt, because you're sort of like dealing with the possibility of there being something, yet there's no context really justifying that. That looking for a spider or thinking that could possibly be a spider. That's the obsession. So 100% irrelevant. That's a unique process, at least we think so. That's the claim of the theory behind I-CBT. This is a process that is sort of unique to IBA. Now, theoretically and empirically, which actually Jean-Sebastian Odette, one of my students, gave a presentation about it last week. Just to emphasize like how profound this is to some extent. When you look at whether there's direct evidence for the obsession in the here and now. We had raters from appraisal-based model, doctoral students who have no allegiance to any model, and therapists from the IBA model, had them rate narratives and had them rate on a scale from 0 to 100, whether there was any direct evidence in these narratives on a scale from 0 to 100. The average was 5, so meaning minimal, basically 0 all the time in these obsessional narratives. I think that's significant because it goes back to this idea, yes, I mean, yeah, there may be some confusion that a little bit that people think sometimes there's in it, or maybe sometimes there is, but the vast majority of obsessional narratives, that evidence is lacking. It makes it very different from an anxiety disorder. And I think the empirical evidence so far seems to support this idea of it being 100% irrelevant to the here and now. And like you say, you said it, Karen, which is very important. Doesn't mean it's not possible, but I mean, a lot of things are possible. Why are you sort of like worrying about this one possibility as if it's a probability that is relevant to the here and now? That tells you there's something else going on. This is the story, which is a subjective story where you convince yourself, but nothing in the here and now sort of justifies it. So that's just what I wanted to add here.
I think it's always so helpful to get clarification on all of this. I'm going to give another example of a client who was very worried about contamination. I'm going to bring contamination home from my office to the home. It will spread. I can see it move across the floor when I put down my briefcase. That contamination is going to get my kids sick. And what she really loved about this module was, I can totally see how that's my imagination.
Yeah. People with OCD, they're okay with it. They say like, yeah, I can see that. Often, like if there's overwide ideation, maybe not. If the confusion is very strong, but in many cases, it's people with OCD. Yeah, it's from my imagination. I think it still be possible and continues to bother me. But yeah, I can see it sort of like there's no direct evidence in the here and now. Of course, they get stuck on, but it's still possible, right? And then you have to move into the selectivity of the doubt. And just because something is possible doesn't make it relevant. And that's why this worksheet is so important in a way, because it's sort of like the centrality. It's the essence of this worksheet is the essence of inferential confusion of the model. So yeah, that's important to understand. But thank you for your explanations. Thank you for all your explanations so far. It's very good. I really like the example as well with the airplane. It's so obvious that it's taken out of context. It's not relevant.
And it impacts her life dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
I like from the worksheet, what is wrong with obsessional doubt story? Like, this is a really interesting question to just be able to reflect on, of looking at that obsessional doubts and understanding wait a second, have I taken this out of context? What
Right.
is going on here in my process?
And these are also things that later on you go in deeper, right? With the reasoning distortions that are in the narrative, how the OCD is able to manage through these reasoning devices, how the OCD is able to manage to make the possible seem relevant to the here and now. That's no small feat to do that. OCD is very good at that. I mean, I don't want to talk about the OCD as if it exists apart from the person, because it comes from within, but sometimes it's useful to take that step back a little bit and say, like, how can it be possible with something that's just a possibility, and many possibilities you don't worry about, but somehow you're able to make it relevant to you in the here and now? Well, it's not, those are the tricks of the OCD. But that's a different worksheet. But that is also expanded upon further in therapy, or at any time it's relevant, you can get into that.
I added this slide, and I may change it, but the reason I added this slide, because oftentimes I will hear, but there is evidence for my doubts. And I wanted just to slow it down and really understand where, where's the process? What's it look like? And I will come back to this, why there are dots here, and you will hear about my twister example. But I don't know if you agree with this one, but this is really, I was trying to simplify, how do we get to irrelevancy?
Right, exactly. Well, it's actually very nicely done, because with a plus sign, you can even say, look, when we say there's no evidence in the senses, that's not what IBA is saying. It's saying there's no direct evidence in the senses. That's the imaginary part, right? It's always indirect, meaning sort of like, I mean, things may have happened in the past that come from the senses,
Right.
There are maybe things are happening in the senses, but it's not direct evidence. They don't form a justification, a real, not a real justification for the obsession itself when it's happening, So it's always, whatever evidence there is remote from, it's very remote from the obsession itself, for example, if I go outside and I feel rushed and I see myself locking the door, I can say, well, in my senses, I sort of like felt rushed, So there's something in my senses. Yeah, but it's not direct evidence that I forgot to lock the door. You just did it, or I just did it, right? So there may be information in the senses, but the whole idea is that it's sort of like applied in an arbitrary and out of context manner. So it's not direct evidence. And last week I gave another example, right? A person may have a groinal response, but that particular or sexual sensation, but in the case of OCD, it doesn't form any justification for whatever they fear or whatever the obsessional doubt is. Like, I might be a child molester, I might be a dangerous person, whatever that sensation is, and where it comes from is somehow occurred for a different reason than what the person fears. That's just characteristic of OCD. If that's not the case, then it's probably not OCD. That's what IBA would argue. It would not be an obsessional doubt, something else. If somebody really had evidence in the senses, well, then it's a real thing, right? Whatever that may be. But this graph in itself is correct because you have the plus sign in there, right? So.
And oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I was wondering if I could use a lived experience and bring that in, if we could use that for exploring this to help me better understand. So, maybe it's because it's not OCD, right? But like recently was taking my dog to a dog sitter, new dog sitter for me. We have 3 dogs, actually, too many dogs. Taking my dog to a dog sitter, and have the thought, almost in my mind, flashes of ways they could die. I'm imagining every possibility. They could run away. They could, they could get injured by another animal. I'm having all these possibilities in my mind. And then, luckily the story has a happy ending, but one of my dogs nearly died, right? Like, and so it's to your point, it's not probable, but it's possible. I'm certainly going to take my dogs to dog sitters again. But we have these experiences of patients who have these fears that are not probable, but then do come to be seemingly true. And so I just wonder if you could speak to that.
But that's a worry, right? That's a worry in the context of bringing your dog to a strange place or to a dog sitter that you don't really know.
Right.
I mean, sure, sort of makes sense to have some worries, right? Can be exaggerated, maybe. Generalized anxiety disorder can be an exaggerated worry, but that's not necessarily out of context, right?
Got it.
Right? It can be dysfunctional if you worry too much, but it wouldn't be OCD. I mean, so with OCD, there really is this thing happening that really happens out of context. Whatever the worry is, the obsession, the doubt, obsessional doubt, it's very remote and out of coercion, entirely out of context. That's also clinically when we diagnose OCD, right? That we look for that intuitively. We don't spell it out in our minds, but we look for that intuitively. There's something weird out of context happening. We don't always do that consciously when we identify, but as a clinician, that's what you look for in the diagnosis. You know, otherwise it's just usually a fear of some kind, or a worry or an anxiety disorder, whatever it may be. There's something peculiar going on in OCD, and that is what we're talking about here.
I really appreciate that, because I think within the general anxiety treatment community, there's a lot of debate about, is generalized anxiety really just OCD? Where do they overlap? Where are they different?
Right.
And I think this really speaks to that from the perspective and the research you have, and that really helps.
Yeah. I mean, there was this moment where OCD was taken out of the in the DSM, out of the anxiety disorder. We were thrilled, of course, because it made sense to us. It was taken out for the wrong reasons, but I think not because of IBA. But no, I don't think OCD has a lot of anxiety, but I don't believe OCD is an anxiety disorder. It's a belief disorder or a disorder of the imagination. But it's not a and both are the same thing. Belief disorder, disorder of the imagination, two sides of the same coin. But it's not an anxiety, a belief disorder.
Thank you.
Or a disorder of the imagination. It's not an official term for it. It's just OCD. There was a question in chat. If it's not an anxiety disorder, then what is it? So I'm saying a belief disorder. Yeah. Other belief disorder would be delusional disorder, right? OCD is not a delusion, but it falls within that category in terms of there's a process of reasoning involved, and there's an imaginative component involved. It's I think anybody who has seen OCD over the years, they know it's not like an anxiety disorder. Even though most models still treat it in terms of its development, still treat it like a phobic disorder. This whole pattern of reinforcement, right? The old phobic model is still applied to OCD. I-CBT turns away from that. It's not an anxiety disorder. It doesn't deny the enormous effect of anxiety and the importance of it in terms of motivating the compulsions, but it starts with the obsessional doubt, which is where this sort of like disordered reasoning is occurring, and this disordered imagination is occurring. Sorry, Karen. I hope it's okay. I'm adding to this.
Please
Okay.
do.
Okay, good.
It takes the pressure off me, so I fully
All right.
support it.
Good.
And
good.
I wanted to thank Rachel for that example, because when we say it out loud, it really helps us see the context. And so I think the more that we do that and throughout, what is this? I think we get much better at noticing the sensory information in the here and now. Right. This is from the manual. Highlight for the client the imagination, the lack of sensory data in the here and now. You don't have to convince your client that their doubt is irrelevant. They're going to come to that conclusion through the process. So you can really fall into a trap here of trying to persuade them. And you really want to take a step back and really walk them through the process and pay attention to the process. One example sometimes we start with our clients' non-OCD content to build the awareness. And the reason why this is so helpful is, as many of my clients, and I say to myself, oh, it's easier to see it when it doesn't impact you, when it's not your belief system. And so we start wherever our clients are ready to start to notice how to understand the obsessional doubts. And here are just some questions. What would need to happen for such a doubt to be relevant? And this goes back to the meteor one. Like, how would you know if a meteor is gonna be falling on your head? Like, what kind of information would you need to believe that you're in danger of a meteor falling on you? Can you think of some other places where you feel confident and where you do not doubt your senses? This is going to go to the selectivity of the OCD story. I'm going to give you an example of selectivity, but this is a really empowering question when people start to notice their belief system doesn't follow them through in every situation. Only in the OCD story will they act differently. So comparing the non-OCD versus the OCD situations and understanding how they act differently is a really aha moment for many people. It's really, I think, a place where we can really validate that there's something here, there's a process going on that's really absorbing you into your imagination. Oops, sorry, I went too fast. This is an example of my twister. This is what I tend to do in my office with adults and with kids. The green is the real events that's triggered the client. I find this is really validating to know that this did not pop up just for no reason. There was a real trigger. There was something that's really gotten this sequence going. The yellow is the crossover point, but if you notice that one, it gets a bit blurry. Red is the imaginal absorption. You can have a lot of red dots. The more you try to use possibilities to justify our obsessional doubts, the more doubt you get. So you might notice the red sequence starts to get much longer and longer. And the blue is the overlay of doubt. And what you can do with your clients is really start to show them how their sequence and how their obsessional doubts can really take them away from what they know or what their senses or what their common sense is telling them. When it's a normal doubt sequence, it's very short. What you notice, it usually tends to go green dot, green dot, green dot, and you just kind of move through a lot of life events. This is where your non-OCD content is. They'll notice how they really do trust their senses. But when you get absorbed in the obsessional doubt, especially when they're trying to use probability to prove that their justification makes sense, you'll notice that it's a very long sequence.
Can you talk more, Karen, about the blue dots?
The blue dots are often where we start to talk about where's the justification for the imaginal absorption? Where did this come from? Well, this is our hearsay. This is our out of context facts. This is my heart is beating really fast. So obviously this must mean something. So we might go sensations. We're really looking at out of context and trying to understand how that's getting us absorbed more often. Does that help, Emily?
Yes, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Fred, did you want to add something?
Yeah, this is great. I really like that, and with the dots, and because it goes also back to that that normal doubt is very easily resolved, and it's a nice visual thing to make that point. I like the way that everybody's explaining I-CBT in their own terms, in their own words, and their own analogies, and using their own metaphors, which makes it so much richer. So I really like this slide. One thing that occurred to me, which was the previous slide, which is like we don't convince people, or the one before that, we don't convince people that OCD is 100% irrelevant. It's true. We don't convince people in terms of like, we don't challenge the possibilities that they come up with. It goes back to, we don't challenge the fact that these things are possible, or that there are elements in the story that can be true, or even if they're not true, you don't really challenge that in IBA. Or if you don't believe in it, a very religious person, for example, may have all kinds of religious elements in the story that you would disagree with, but that they use as justification for the doubt. You don't challenge those elements. But what you do challenge, at least I do, I think we're all individually a little bit different, but I do challenge the idea that the obsession is incorrect on the basis of the out of context application of the information in the narrative. So you don't so much challenge the content, or you don't challenge it on the basis of the content of the narrative. You challenge it on the basis of the process by which the person arrives at the obsessional doubt. And I can go pretty hard into that in that sense. So in that sense, there's a challenging in I-CBT that's different from ACT. With ACT is just process and let a person arrive at a conclusion. No, with I-CBT would at one point say clearly, no, this doubt is irrelevant. That's what makes it obsessional. And it's not true. It's possible, yes, but it's not relevant for this and this reason, because you're applying out of context information to the here and now. So it's not wrong in the abstract, the obsession, it's possible, but the way you apply to it and the way you constructed it and the way you arrived at it is wrong. And you agree with that, because your reasoning, that goes back to the selectivity of the doubt, your reasoning in other situations is different. So you already agree with the fact that it's wrong, you just don't realize it yet. That's the confusion, right, between reality and imagination in the obsessional situation. But in other situations outside of that, the person is readily able to agree that the reasoning is different. So you try to have them apply the same reasoning in the obsessional situation, then they would arrive at a different conclusion, or they would arrive at least the conclusion that the doubt is irrelevant. So when we talk about process, yes, but that process does render something irrelevant. So it's not entirely just process. There is a challenging involved of the obsession, but on the basis of process. It does not change the elements in the narrative, and nor does it challenge what comes after the obsession. For example, if I have a valid doubt that I may have forgotten to lock the door, I may have the consequential fear or the consequential idea that my house might be robbed. That's a valid idea within the context of thinking that I may have forgotten to lock the door. But it starts with the idea that it's already false to start with because of it is generated. I saw a question come up. How often do you get into debates with people with OCD who are resistant to this concept that the doubt is irrelevant? And how do you navigate this? I don't think you really get, if you explain it, and if it is irrelevant, I mean, I don't see, sometimes the person is not entirely convinced, but that's part of the OCD. You just have to approach it from different angles to explain it to them and show to them that it's irrelevant, which goes back to the reasoning errors. And I find most people with OCD, because they so desperately want to get out of the OCD to start with, pay a lot of attention to that and consider it seriously, you know? So it's not a matter of the debate. I think the risk for debate is far greater if you start challenging the values of the person, or if you start challenging the content of the narrative, the individual content of the ideas in the narrative, you know? That's where the debates happen. So I-CBT is actually quite good at circumventing those debates by going towards the process and showing to the person how that invalidates the conclusion. We don't directly address the elements in the narrative or the conclusion itself, but through the process. And I've said this before on several occasions, I-CBT was developed specifically, we started out in the 90s, was developed for those with overwide ideation. Those are people who are very convinced in the reality of their obsession, who have a personal investment, who are sort of like, don't want to change the idea. And we know that traditional ERP and I-CBT, appraisal-based CBT, doesn't work as well. There's sort of like not as much of a response. And we know that I-CBT, the evidence is starting to emerge that it works better. Why does it work better? Exactly because we don't challenge. There's less chance of getting into a debate with a person with OCD by focusing on the process and not actually challenging the content. Now, this is starting to change in appraisal-based therapy as well, where they say more and more, yeah, we sort of collecting information in order to make people think differently about their beliefs, etc. But there's still more of an element of challenging in there. But on the other hand, I-CBT would not go as far as ACT either. It's just process, and I-CBT would be clear about the fact that the obsession is wrong, that the obsession needs to be dismissed and that it needs to be rejected. So I just wanted to add that to clarify that. The extent to which you go about it can vary, and it's through the process, not by directly attacking the person's values or the content of the beliefs. Is that does that clarify the question I got? I forgot who it was.
Yeah, that was really helpful.
All right,
thank you. I think that and debate was probably too strong of a word that I used. I haven't actually gone into really intense debates, but I've definitely noticed, like, you know, when you kind of,
well, I mean, it's
and people are resistant.
It's a touchy issue because that's sort of like has been forever been the sort of mantra of the appraisal-based model and ERP model as well. Stay away from the obsession, because if you address the obsession, then you're going to get into trouble. You're reinforcing the OCD, etc. You're debating with the client, which is valid to some extent, but it's not what IBA does. It goes towards the process behind it in order to render the obsession irrelevant and why it must be dismissed because of that. But we don't get into a debate. I think that fear, and you'll see that often, that's going to come up again and again, that people will say, like, yeah, I-CBT addresses the content, you're going to get into a debate and you're reinforcing the OCD. You're not, because you're focused on the process behind it. But we do take a clear stance, I-CBT, that the process renders the obsession wrong, incorrect. It's subtle, it's nuanced, but in the end, that is the consequence of if the process is wrong by which the obsessional doubt comes about, then it's wrong, right? So that is an element of I-CBT.
I think a good example, which I actually skipped this slide, would be talking about how we don't have to debate it, but the client will see it. And here's an example of selective faucets. In my bathroom, I have to touch the handle 3, 8, or 26 times so it will turn off. And when you start to look at other faucets at the airport or at school or at a family member's, I don't have to do any of that. How do you know if faucet's turned off? Well, the water stops running. And in this situation, what happened for this individual, they were able actually to be able to refute the obsessional doubt all on their own. They didn't need a debate, but they were able to see the selectivity of how 3, 8, or 26 had nothing to do with turning off the faucet. I already talked about Twister. In the handbook, it talks about neutral practice. This happens to be one that I did. I took a cookie. It was for a client's birthday, so we were having cookies. You might be able to identify what type of OCD she has in this example. but we took the cookie out of the container. Actually, she opened the container, she took the cookie out, and we practiced what ifs. And she came up with some really gross examples of what if could happen to this cookie, and was able to notice that it's really easy to stir up obsessional doubt when you really focus on saying the what ifs out loud. Yet it didn't stop her from going back to eat the cookie. And we were really talking about what is it that helps us when we are in the obsessional story, and what is the evidence that is not supportive in the obsessional story. So ask the client what makes these what if stories irrelevant. And for her, if you want to know, her response was, I like cookies more than I care about what happened to the cookie before it got here. And she made her harm OCD irrelevant in this story. But are all these possibilities? Perhaps. But she was able to really let go of the story and let go of the checking and the seeking of reassurance. I just added quiz 6. I know sometimes people are like, where are the answers and stuff. So I just happened to add quiz 6 to the PowerPoint so that people could kind of put it all together. And I bolded the parts that we highlighted today. And I think that's it. That's all I got for you.
Karen, would you do the neutral practice with the person's theme, or would you not do it with their theme?
I would start the neutral practice as neutral. And so for this individual, it was really, we were just having a cookies. She happened to bring her theme into it. And so I was like, let's roll. So we were just trying to make a cookie a what if experience.
So you were really trying, just the purpose of that exercise was to try to help them see how we can just make doubts. And
Yeah.
it's so natural and ingrained in us as humans, and we can, that was
Yep.
kind of the purpose of it. Okay.
Absolutely.
This was awesome. I can't believe you did this in such a short amount of time. All right, can you add this to the group? Can you upload this?
I will definitely upload it. I just have to do a little proofreading, but I will definitely put it up there.
This was incredible. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll definitely, when you do that, Karen, we'll also add it to the Dropbox.
Absolutely.
And Karen, yeah, this was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. I wanted to chime in about the irrelevancy of OCD. And so as Fred was saying, like the challenging, for me, it really just kind of comes down to, that's what makes this OCD, right? Because if the doubt is relevant, then it's no longer OCD. And so I've never really had to do like a lot of challenging on that. Karen, as you mentioned, it's like the clients kind of arrive at that on their own, because if it's relevant, then it's not OCD. And it just kind of like makes it more clear for them. So I just haven't had a whole lot of like needing to bicker with clients about it at all. Because for them, they're kind of more trying to learn how to sort between, you know, obsessional doubt and normal doubt, more than they are trying to defend their own irrelevant OCD doubt.
I have a question. So I'm a trauma specialist and a certified trauma therapist, and I also do OCD. And a lot of my trauma clients have OCD. In this context, because a lot of the OCD themes center around trauma, their trauma. Has anyone worked with that? Have you found things that don't work with this approach, or that it works better? I'm just curious if anyone else does that and what their experience is.
I also
Okay.
do trauma work, but yeah, Tori, I haven't done I-CBT with trauma. I've just done ERP and PE, kind of worked it that way. So I
Okay.
can't speak to it.
I just want to
Um,
say I really appreciate your question, Tori. I just yesterday was working with someone who has a very convoluted nighttime routine about switching things off, who for the first time shared with me that in college, when she hadn't turned something off, something really awful happened that the person involved blamed it on her not turning off the light. And I just can see how for certain people that becomes it's possible and the experience that they then draw from. And I'm not a trauma therapist. That's not my specialization. So I'm really glad that you asked, and I'm anticipating people's really thoughtful answers.
I'm doing actually working with one client that has complex PTSD, and we're doing this. So I'll report back and see, let you know how it goes with her.
So I'll add that the I-CBT I don't use for trauma. I don't know if that was the question, but it's important. I think that it's important to separate those, just like we would if we were providing ERP or any other OCD treatment, is to really treat the trauma. And we can recognize that sometimes that, there's a little bit of a hydraulic relationship between treating OCD. I guess the literature is kind of mixed on that, but I think it is important to sort between what is the obsessional doubt and what is trauma, and to treat those separately. And we can recognize that sometimes that personal lived experience can be used in the logic of OCD, but it still wouldn't be OCD. Those are going to be very different. You're going to have trauma symptoms that look similar to OCD, like the rituals or the checking the door, or the different symptoms of trauma. But no, I do not apply inference-based therapy to trauma. I refer a client to work on trauma therapy while I provide therapy for their OCD symptoms.
Oh, yeah, I wasn't implying that. I definitely do trauma and OCD separately. But I have one client that right now we're working on the OCD part of it. And one of the things that's hard with trauma is that they're stuck in the past because of their trauma. And so the sensory part is a little harder for them. And I was just wondering if anyone else had worked with that at all.
I would check with Bronwyn on the Facebook group. She does a lot of trauma work, and she's also skilled in inference-based. So Bronwyn Schreier, I don't know if she's in the group today, but she's definitely on Facebook. So she might be a good one to reach out to.
Thank you. I'll do that.
I wondered in the last minute or two, so I got my first outpatient to choose IBT over ERP, and I tried to
Hold on
continue.
just a second, Emily. I'm gonna shut down the recording.